So Cater, thank you very much. A great presentation. We already have a few questions in the chat, and just to remind everybody that if you're on Facebook, please send them to Randall or Mackenzie. And then if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and I will mention them to Cater. So our first one, we have two that are similar, Cater, and it does address some of the issues dealing with soil health and cotton response. So I'm going to put the two questions together. And that is, there's been discussion around West Texas about the use of hemp.
Yes.
And the question is, does hemp provide a much needed diversity crop for the region? And how does hemp use impact soil health relative to what cotton does?
Yeah, no, great question. I think rotating any rotations of any sort are beneficial. So if you've got continuous wheat or continuous cotton, bringing in diversity in there is really important. Now, when you're looking at a crop where you're removing the biomass, the contributions are really the roots, and you don't. You know, that's one of the nice things about cotton is we leave the leaves and the stems and the burrs out there. And actually the extraction from the soil is primarily carbon dioxide with a little bit of NP and K in the protein in the seed. The one thing I did want to mention on the hemp, and in West Texas, we're very familiar with emus, buying a breeding pair of emus and ostriches. If you're going to invest heavily into hemp for one of the pharmaceuticals, you need to look at Jay Kiesling's articles on doing it in yeast. And so the gentleman that created the fermentation system to create artemisinin has applied his clever synthetic biology skills to making just about every single variant of CBD oil or THC in a very pure, probably much lower cost. And his articles does have a disclaimer that there's some companies up and running. So I'd be a little cautious about that.
Sure, sure. So one of the questions had to deal with cotton's impact on soil health. Could you talk a little bit more about where that came from and what producers are doing now to circumvent that issue?
I love that issue because when I went through undergraduate school, I was taught that cotton was hard on the soil. And so I dug out the story. You have to go back to 1896, and there's a book called The Cotton Plant by the USGA that explains that the farmers of the time understood that cotton could tolerate infertile soil, and it didn't need anywhere the nutrition that vegetable crops or feed crops, grain crops needed. And so they talk about how they took the cotton seed off the cotton fields and they applied that as fertilizer. And we're familiar with cottonseed meal as a fertilizer. They applied it to the fields that were used to grow both the vegetables and the feed crops. And in that same article, they also talk about the manures and how those were not used on the cotton. So you can imagine if you rode by on a horse after 20 years of this, boy, that cotton field looked pretty ragged and pretty low in nutrients, pretty hard on it, because all the nutrients have been pulled off in the seed and put on that other field. But monoculture, anything, in my opinion, is really bad. And so I think that the first thing that growers can do for soil health is to rotate, regardless of what it is.
So given your experience with West Texas, to follow up on that question, how do you see cotton rotation now? Or are we over 50% of fields rotated, or where are we with that number?
Well, I think it really depends on the north-south gradient. Obviously, you move up into the panhandle, and those have a history of grain and cotton is coming in, but then you move way to the south, and we still have a very high percentage. I had a chance to work overseas, and I'm now in my mind in Larissa, Texas. Larissa, Greece, and I'm driving around Larissa, Greece with the agronomist. And I'm asking, do you guys rotate? And they say, oh, yeah, we rotate all the time. and I look at 100 fields and it's all cotton, contiguous cotton. So you can go into an area, and if you see cotton, cotton, cotton in all the fields in 1 year, that's a pretty good bet that you could do the percent rotation. And so we get further south on the high plains, and we really uh, miss out on the rotation just because there's very few crops that will generate that. And so that's where some of the innovations, like going to 1 year cotton and 1 year, that's a rotation. In fact, it may be even a better rotation because you're growing biomass out there that you're leaving. But it does have those economic impediments that we talked about, that only certain growers can get over that hump to take advantage of that.
Yep, very good. We have a question relating to your beer production, and so could you talk a little bit more?
Sure.
I mean, how relevant or how likely is it to produce beer from cotton?
It's not, but the circular economy in agriculture is a challenge when we're dealing with mixed fibers in textiles. And a lot of the products you buy Under Armour, you don't get 100% cotton, you get a polyester cotton blend. And anytime you blend fibers together, it just makes it much, much more difficult to recycle that. And so one of the technologies that we've invested in is a biodegradation of the cellulose component, so that you move that out of the mix and you then actually create sugar that's probably going to go on into a fermentation process. I don't think you'd want to use it to make beer, but you certainly might use it to make ethanol for gasoline. But then you remove that contaminant, so to speak, in the polyester stream, and you have something that can feed into a circular economy a lot more practical.
One last question to follow up, then there's some questions on the chat I have to get to. How much of the cotton textile used textiles is actually recycled or around the world?
Well, you have to look at the pre-consumer or post-consumer recycling, because there's a tremendous recycling pre-consumer. So within a textile mill, they're constantly sorting out and taking little bits of short staple and pulling it out to make higher quality garments, and that's all reused. So there's very little waste, even in the in the yarn and the cutting and sewing. So within the textile arena, there's very, very little waste. The post-consumer is, I'll be real frank, it's a real challenge, just as it is with most products. There was a wonderful science article now maybe 4 years ago, looking at the mass flow for aluminum around the world. And if I remember, it was maybe less than a quarter of the aluminum actually got recycled, despite the energy benefit of recycling aluminum versus taking it from bauxite. And we've had 60 years of trying to recycle aluminum cans. So I'll be honest with you, I don't know the number, but I suspect it's a very, very small amount. And a lot of that is driven because blends just make it really hard. Now, the cotton is fully biodegradable and it's compostable, and that's probably the best way to make a circular economy with it.
Okay, very good. So let me go back to the chat. This is from Teresa Bird. What about substituting hemp for textiles, and what's the practicality of that?
Well, one of the advantages of natural fibers is they have different characteristics, and so you can add functionality to a cotton garment by bringing in either wool or hemp. And so those are some of the things that we do have a textile research department that looks at those, because traditionally people would bring in a nylon or polyester or some other spandex or something like that to add functionality. But more and more the consumers want a fully natural product. And Texas is familiar with that. I know going back into the 90s, the the Texas Tech with the what's called the Fiber Now, the research center there was looking at wool cotton blends to add functionality. So that's a real benefit for bringing in a diversity of fibers.
Mhm. Very good. Okay. Could you compare or talk about water requirements for cotton to other agricultural crops, and how does it compare quantitatively?
And that, that's a wonderful question, because one of the unique characteristics of cotton, and I tried to talk about it with that responsiveness to whether it's rainfall or irrigation, in that you can get something to harvest with about 17 inches of rainfall. So it is incredibly drought tolerant, if that's all it gets. But the stomates stay open in the middle of the day, except under severe stress. So it does have the potential to actually utilize quite a bit more water, and where we've got a straight line between water used and yield produced. So it's both a very miserly plant with water, but if the water is available, it will use it and continue to put on a crop. It's one of the most responsive crops. So relative to the other crops, it's less than corn because it does tolerate crop. It's certainly less than a grass crop or alfalfa. It would be more than, say, wheat, primarily because wheat is grown during the winter when the ET is low. Um, but there are really good studies. USDA Bushlands put some nice publications out on the relative amount of water use compared to other crops.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Um, Another question that's come in is, how difficult would it be for cotton farmers to transition to another crop similar to cotton? Many people worry about farmers losing their crops due to both climate change and, on the other side, climate action.
Well, I'm not sure. Let me respond to climate change, and then John, you can give me a definition of climate action. I'm not quite sure what that one means. But so the ability of farmers to move to other crops, that's a legitimate question, and I think that we need to help farmers. Society has a huge benefit from having a safe and stable supply of food and fiber that's grown within our borders. And then you add in the benefits of regenerative agriculture, whether it be dust and human health, or whether it be all the other ecosystem services that healthy agriculture generates, and also the potential for some carbon sequestration in soil. So I think that the challenge is helping farmers. Obviously, you need some new equipment, maybe new harvesters, new processors. Um, and when margins are tight for growers, those things are really just extremely difficult for growers and particularly young growers are getting started.
Mhm.
So I think society, and again, this is Cater Hake speaking. I'm off the clock well after 5 o'clock. I think society would really benefit from helping them with those transitions.
Yeah, with respect to climate action, I mean, I'm gonna view that as how the person's going to respond to climate change and the capacity. One of the things I think most people don't realize is the impact, and you mentioned this, about how our insurance programs sometimes subvert this whole process and the detriment of that program.
I think you're totally right, and that's where I think there's some real opportunities to look at those and tweak them. But let me just talk a little bit about the West Texas farmer, because I think from the standpoint of being responsive to adverse weather, West Texas growers have had that for quite a few decades, and so if there's a group of farmers that are better able to adapt to a changing climate, it's the West Texas farmers, because they've developed the ones that have survived. They've developed both the financial and the strength, knowing that they may go 3 years without Christmas, and the skill set to be hyper responsive to what's going on out in the field. And that's unique. I've worked around the world, and I think the West Texas growers really exemplify those capabilities.
Okay, good. So we've got a couple questions in the question and answer part. What's your view on doing cover crops winter every year, leaving the residue in the soil while cultivating cotton on every other year? I believe the cover crop will keep the soil intact. What have you seen or heard from producers in terms of both the cost of doing that and what improvement they have seen?
Well, we've seen an explosion of cover crops in the last 10 years in Texas. I was the extension agronomist out of West Texas in the mid 90s, and it was extremely rare to see cover crops there. We know about the benefits, and the prime one that growers look at is the wind protection, and particularly the blowing sand and the dust. And we're learning that even a small amount of residue helps there. But Dr. Zach, your research is really opening up, some of the other benefits. You buy it for the wind protection, but then you get all these other things that you realize. I think the balance that growers make in West Texas is the water supply and how much water they use to grow something that they don't harvest and that they don't sell. And that's growers struggle with that, obviously, and it's very difficult. Only farmers like some of the ones that I've mentioned that really have that relationship with the landlord can take on those type of really innovative practices with cover crops.
Yeah, and being able to get some idea of how it's going to work and how to manage it.
Absolutely. And all the little tweaks, the pictures that I showed of RN and Ronnie, they now have some weeds out there that normally they would control with a herbicide, but they also have this totally novel summer dormant perennial grass, and that they don't have the history or knowing what's going to keep it alive and control the weeds.
Sure.
So just a lot of systems component that research and extension would really help in collaboration with farmers.
Yeah, very good. There's a technical question that looks at, have you considered or has the group working on fiber separation from polyfibers and cotton using enzymes to separate the cotton out?
Well, we're using enzymes to degrade the cotton and make sugar, but enzymes that's an interesting idea. I think that's a great suggestion, because we're now seeing enzymes that are being developed that degrade polyester. And so, that's turned into the state of the art is a degradation of enzymes. I don't think they're commercial, but I occasionally see papers once a year or so with some novel enzyme strategy to degrade polyester. Great idea.
Yep. Okay, we have a few more minutes and there's a couple more great questions on. So one person wrote, one aspect the industry can look at is to develop sustainable industrial products. So what are some of the issues going forward in terms of the actual product that's made from cotton relative to its sustainability?
Yeah, for my board, the growers, the 160 growers that control Cotton Incorporated, and the importers that also control, they have put sustainability at the top of their list for 7 years. And our CEO was out front talking with the growers about it now about 13 years, when for some growers, honestly, it was close to a swear word. And he had a wonderful point. He said, if we don't measure where we are right now, we're not going to be able to really brag about and take credit for the improvements that happen over the next 10 years. And so, cotton is unique. It's the only agriculture crop that there's a petroleum alternative. And so if the consumers, they never go into a quick stop and ask for a corn 6-pack, a corn drink, right? But we do want them going in and asking for a pair of cotton denim. So the interest that the brands and retailers initially had, driven by NGOs on sustainability, is we heard it from the very beginning. And so our entire programs look at, trying to find those parts of our production system and make them more sustainable, whether it's nitrogen fertilizer, phosphorus fertilizer, or pest control inputs. So it's definitely top of mind for everything we do.
Very good, thank you. Let's see. So we're getting to our last minute or so. One of the questions that has just come up is, I believe what they are asking is, farmers are worried about government restrictions will shut down their farms.
Oh, that's, a policy issue, and I've been working with cotton farmers for 40 years. There's a strong selection. Farmers, they risk multiple decades, multiple generations of inheritance every year that they put seed in the ground. And so there's a strong self-selection for that independence, being their own boss, and being in charge, being in control. I couldn't do it. I like being a wage earner and knowing that I'm going to get paid for that year's worth of work. So I think, clearly farmers are a unique set of people because of that independent, strong self-selection. And we're going to get some comments like that.
So we have maybe a couple, about half a minute or so. As climate does change, and particularly for West Texas, you've made in previous meetings talking about growing cotton moving northward.
Yes.
And so can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think the number, if I remember, is like 1 mile. I won't even pull it out of the air, but clearly we've seen that in my life. We're growing cotton way north of Amarillo into Kansas. They're talking about a substantial acreage in Kansas. It's a wonderful growth opportunity to be looking further and further north, particularly if growers have that risk capability and can manage those uncertain weather storms like what came in September of last year, took out a lot of damage to Kansas cotton.
Right.
But I think you're absolutely right. It's going to be a nice rotation with grain crops in the northern, where mid-high plains.
That's right. That's very good. Well, folks, we've come to our 6 o'clock hour. So, Cater, thank you very much for this presentation and for joining us. And thank you all for being here and participating in some great questions on the chat. So I'm going to turn it back to Mackenzie and Randall. Thank you all.